Anyone want to trade wives? This one's stubborn and way too independent for her own good. My husband's voice cut through the warm Tennessee evening like a blade, and I watched as the laughter rippled through my sister's backyard. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat hung heavy in the humid Nashville air, but suddenly I couldn't taste anything at all. I stood near the picnic table, holding a plate of coleslaw I had made from scratch that morning, and felt the familiar sting of his words settle into my chest like a splinter I had learned to ignore over the years of our marriage. My name is Jocelyn. I am 32 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have been married to Brandon, a man who once made me believe I was the most important person in his entire world. Standing there at my sister Chloe's summer barbecue, surrounded by family and neighbors who shifted uncomfortably at his joke, I realized how far we had drifted from those early promises we made to each other at the altar. Brandon stood by the grill, beer in hand, that familiar smirk plastered across his face like a mask he wore for public occasions. He was performing for an audience, the way he always did at gatherings like this one. My accomplishments, my personality, my very essence, reduced to a punchline for cheap laughs from people who didn't know what happened behind our closed doors. "Come on, any takers?" he continued, gesturing toward me with his beer bottle. "She works too much. She's got opinions about everything under the sun, and don't even get me started on how she always thinks she knows better than everyone else in the room. Seriously, fellas, I'm practically giving her away here for free." I felt my sister's eyes on me from across the yard, filled with that mixture of sympathy and frustration I had grown accustomed to seeing over the years we had been together. Chloe had never liked Brandon, not since our first Christmas together when he made a snide comment about her cooking skills, but she had learned to hold her tongue for my sake and for family peace. The other guests shuffled their feet awkwardly, some offering weak chuckles that died in their throats, others pretending to be very interested in their paper plates of potato salad. And then there was Gavin. Gavin lived 3 houses down from us on Maple Avenue, in a modest brick house with a well-maintained garden full of roses and hydrangeas. He was 35, single, and had moved into the neighborhood about 2 years ago after his own marriage ended in divorce. He worked as an architect at a firm downtown and kept mostly to himself, though he was always polite and friendly when we crossed paths on the sidewalk or at the mailbox in the morning. He had been invited to the barbecue through Chloe's husband, who played basketball with him on Saturday mornings at the community center down the street. Gavin set down his drink on the patio table and looked directly at Brandon with an expression I couldn't quite read at first. "I'll gladly take her." The words hung in the air like smoke from the grill. Brandon's grin faltered for just a second, a crack in his carefully constructed facade, before he forced out a laugh that sounded hollow even to my ears. "Oh, you think you could handle her? Trust me, buddy. You don't know what you're signing up for with this one." "I think I do," Gavin said simply. There was no mockery in his voice, no joking undertone to soften the statement he was making. He turned to look at me, and something in his steady gray gaze made my breath catch in my throat, unexpectedly. "So, what time can I pick you up tomorrow evening?" The backyard went completely silent. I could hear the cicadas screaming in the oak trees that lined the property, the distant sound of a car passing on the street beyond the wooden fence. My husband's face had gone pale beneath his summer tan, the smirk finally wiped clean from his handsome features. He hadn't expected this at all. He never expected anyone to call his bluff, because nobody ever had the courage before now. Something shifted inside me in that moment. It was small at first, like the first crack appearing in a frozen lake before the spring thaw finally comes. Years of swallowed words, dismissed feelings, and quiet humiliations suddenly rose to the surface all at once like bubbles in champagne. I looked at my husband, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years, and saw a stranger who had spent our entire marriage chipping away at everything I was, until I barely recognized myself anymore in the mirror. Then I looked at Gavin, standing there waiting for my answer. 7 p.m., I said. My voice was calm, steady, certain. I didn't recognize it as my own because it had been so long since I had heard myself speak with such conviction about anything. I set down the plate of coleslaw on the wooden table, smoothed the front of my sundress with trembling hands, and walked toward the gate without looking back at anyone. Behind me, I heard Brandon's voice rise in protest, heard my sister call my name with concern in her voice, but I didn't stop walking. I walked down the gravel driveway, past the parked cars baking in the evening sun, and kept walking until I reached the end of the block where the old elm tree provided cool shade. My hands were shaking badly. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it pulsing in my throat like a trapped bird. But for the first time in years, I also felt something else entirely unexpected beneath the fear. I felt free. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring for me. I didn't know if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life or the best decision I had ever made in my 32 years. But standing there on that quiet street corner, with the summer sun beginning to set, and the sounds of the barbecue fading behind me into nothing, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being the punchline of someone else's cruel joke. That night, I sat in the darkness of our living room, listening to the grandfather clock tick on the wall and thinking about how I had arrived at this moment in my life. Brandon hadn't come home yet from the party. I assumed he was still at the barbecue, probably complaining about me to anyone who would listen, spinning the story to make himself the victim of an ungrateful and unreasonable wife. He was good at that particular skill. He had always been good at that. I met Brandon when I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and full of ambition for the future that stretched before me. I had just landed my first real job as a marketing coordinator at Travala Group, a mid-sized packaging company headquartered here in Nashville. He was a sales representative at the same company, charming and confident, with a smile that made me feel like the only person in any room we occupied together. In the beginning, he celebrated my drive and determination like it was something precious. He told me he loved how passionate I was about my career, how I wasn't afraid to speak my mind in meetings or stand up for my ideas when others pushed back. When I got my first promotion after just 18 months of hard work, he took me out to dinner at the nicest restaurant we could afford and told everyone within earshot that his girlfriend was going places in the world. I believed him completely when he said we would build our empire together, partners in every sense of the word. But somewhere along the way, the celebration turned into competition between us. And then the competition turned into resentment that poisoned everything we had built together. It started small, the way these things always do, so gradually that I didn't notice the pattern forming until I was trapped inside it like a fly in amber. A comment here, a joke there, nothing that seemed significant on its own when examined individually. When I got promoted to marketing manager 2 years into the job, he made a crack about how I must have impressed the right people in the right ways to advance so quickly. When I started working late on a major campaign that could make or break my career trajectory, he complained bitterly that I cared more about my job than our marriage and our future together. When I suggested we create a budget to save for a house of our own, he accused me of being controlling and obsessive about money, even though we were barely making ends meet with our combined salaries. The word stubborn became his favorite weapon against me in any disagreement. Every time I stood my ground on something that mattered to me, every time I expressed an opinion that differed from his own, every time I made a decision without consulting him first for his approval, I was being stubborn, too independent for my own good, difficult to deal with, impossible to please no matter what he tried. He turned my strengths into flaws and made me feel guilty for having them in the first place. I thought about the countless dinner parties where he had made similar jokes at my expense, always with that charming smile plastered on so people thought he was just being playful with his wife. The way he would roll his eyes dramatically when I talked about work, as if my career was an inconvenience to his life rather than something to be proud of. The subtle put-downs disguised as humor that left me questioning myself long after the guests had gone home for the night. Was I too focused on my career? Was I neglecting my husband? Was I really as difficult as he made me seem to everyone we knew? My mother had raised me to be strong and self-sufficient after circumstances forced her hand in life. After my father left when I was 12 years old, walking out one morning to buy cigarettes and never coming back. She had worked 2 jobs to keep our family afloat financially. She taught me that a woman should never depend entirely on anyone else for her survival or happiness, that I should build my own foundation and stand on my own 2 feet no matter what life threw at me. I had carried those lessons with me my entire life, like armor against the world. Brandon had once claimed to admire that about me above everything else. Now he resented it with every fiber of his being. I remembered a conversation we had about 3 years into our marriage, late one night after another argument had left us both exhausted and raw. I had been offered a director position at a competing company, a significant step up the corporate ladder with a substantial raise that would have changed everything for us. I was excited beyond words, already planning in my head how we could use the extra income to finally buy that house we had been talking about for years. But Brandon had reacted with anger so intense it frightened me that night. He accused me of trying to outshine him in front of the whole world, of making him look bad in front of his colleagues and friends. He said people would think he couldn't provide for his family if his wife made more money than him, that he would be humiliated publicly. He guilted me into turning down the offer with tears and accusations and days of cold silence, and I had spent all the years since wondering what my life might have looked like if I had taken it instead of staying. Sitting in that dark living room with only the clock for company, I realized how much of myself I had sacrificed on the altar of his fragile ego over the years. I had dimmed my own light so that he wouldn't feel threatened by the glow I naturally gave off. I had swallowed my ambitions, censored my opinions, and shrank myself into a version of Jocelyn that was more palatable to his insecurities and fears. And what had I gotten in return for all that sacrifice? A husband who offered to trade me away at a barbecue like an old car he was tired of maintaining. The front door opened around 11 that night with a crash that startled me. Brandon stumbled in, the smell of beer heavy on his breath, and flipped on the light switch by the door. He looked surprised to see me sitting there in the chair where I had been waiting for hours. "Oh, so you decided to come home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and contempt. "Nice of you to embarrass me in front of everyone and then just disappear like that without a word." I looked at him, this man I had promised to love for better or worse, and felt nothing but bone-deep exhaustion wash over me like a wave. "I'm tired, Brandon," I said quietly. "I'm going to bed now." "We're not done talking about this," he called after me as I climbed the stairs slowly. But I was done. I was so completely done with all of it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Brandon slamming cabinet doors in the kitchen with unnecessary force that echoed through the house. The sun was streaming through the bedroom curtains cheerfully, and for one blissful moment I forgot about the barbecue, the joke, the date I had agreed to attend. Then it all came flooding back with perfect clarity, and my stomach tightened with a mixture of anxiety and something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. I found Brandon sitting at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, a cup of coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking. His jaw was set in that hard line that meant he was gearing up for a fight, his knuckles white around the ceramic mug he was gripping. I poured myself a cup from the pot and leaned against the counter, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. "You need to fix this situation," he said finally, still not looking at me directly. "Fix what exactly?" "The embarrassment you caused me yesterday at your sister's house." He looked up then, his eyes sharp with barely contained anger. "You need to call Gavin right now and tell him it was all a joke. Tell him you're not going on any date with him tonight. And then you need to apologize to me for making me look like a complete fool in front of everyone we know." I set down my coffee cup slowly, deliberately, buying myself time to choose my words carefully. "You made yourself look like a fool, Brandon. You stood in front of our family and neighbors and offered to trade me away like I was some piece of furniture you were tired of owning. That was your choice to make that joke. Not mine. It was a joke." He slammed his hand on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled, and a bit sloshed over the rim onto the wood. "Everyone there knew it was a joke except you and that weirdo neighbor who apparently has a thing for married women. If it was just a joke, Then why are you so upset that someone took you up on it? He stared at me with disbelief, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to formulate a response. Brandon was not used to me pushing back like this against him. Usually, after one of his outbursts, I would retreat into silence, give him space to calm down, and eventually smooth things over with an apology, even when I had done nothing wrong at all. That was our pattern. That was what he expected from me. But I was tired of patterns that left me feeling diminished and small. "Because you're my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that would have frightened me a year ago. "You're mine. You don't get to just agree to go on dates with other men because you're upset about some stupid joke I made." There it was, finally. The truth behind all the humor and deflection finally laid bare for me to see. I was his property, his possession, something to be controlled and displayed according to his whims and desires. Not a partner, not an equal, a thing he owned. "When did you stop seeing me as a person?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him completely off guard. "When did I become just your wife instead of Jocelyn? When did my thoughts and feelings and dreams stop mattering to you at all?" "What are you talking about? Of course you matter to me." "Do I? Because for the past 7 years, you've made me feel like an inconvenience to your life. Every time I succeed at work, you find a way to diminish it or make it about you instead. Every time I express an opinion, you call me stubborn or difficult. Every time I try to have a conversation about our future, you accuse me of being controlling. You've turned every good thing about me into a flaw that needs correcting, and I've let you do it, Brandon. I've let you make me feel small because I thought that's what marriage required. But it's not. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's just slow erosion of who I am as a person." His face had gone red with anger, and something else I couldn't identify. "So what? You're going to go on this date tonight? Is that what this is about? You want to humiliate me even more than you already have?" "This isn't about humiliating you at all. This is about me finally standing up for myself after years of staying silent. You made a choice yesterday when you decided to mock me in front of everyone. Now I'm making mine. If you walk out that door tonight, don't bother coming back here," he said, his voice cold as winter ice. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had loved once. This man I had built a life with. And I felt the last threads of hope snap and fall away like leaves in autumn. "I've spent 7 years coming back," I said calmly. "Coming back after every joke at my expense, every dismissive comment, every fight where you made me feel like I was crazy for wanting more than what you were willing to give. Maybe it's time I stop coming back and start walking forward instead." I left him sitting at that kitchen table with his cold coffee and went upstairs to figure out what I was going to wear. My hands were trembling as I opened the closet doors, but underneath the fear, something else was growing strong. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had forgotten existed. At precisely 7 o'clock that evening, the doorbell rang. I heard Brandon's heavy footsteps cross the living room floor, heard the door open with a creak, and heard Gavin's calm voice say, "Hello, I'm here to pick up Jocelyn." I descended the stairs in a blue dress I hadn't worn in years, my hair down around my shoulders, my chin held high. Brandon stood in the doorway, blocking Gavin's entrance with his body, his fists clenched at his sides. But he didn't say anything. He just stepped aside and watched in silence as I walked past him, out the door, and into the warm summer evening. As Gavin opened the car door for me with a gentle smile, I looked back at the house one last time. Brandon stood on the porch, a silhouette against the lit windows, and for the first time in our marriage, he was the one left wondering what came next. The car pulled away from the curb, and I watched our house grow smaller in the side mirror until it disappeared around the corner. My heart was racing. My palms were sweating against the leather seat, but I didn't ask Gavin to turn around. I didn't apologize or explain or make excuses for what I was doing. I just sat there in the passenger seat as we drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. and let myself imagine what it might feel like to be seen as something more than someone's stubborn, too independent wife. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine what it might feel like to be truly free. The restaurant Gavin had chosen was a quiet Italian place called Orso's on the east side of Nashville. It was the kind of establishment with white tablecloths and real silver, candles flickering on every table, and a menu that didn't bother listing prices because the clientele wasn't supposed to care about such trivial things. I hadn't been somewhere this elegant in years. Brandon always said fancy restaurants were a waste of money we didn't have, that we could eat just as well at home for a fraction of the cost. Another small way he had controlled my life, without me even realizing the cage was being built around me. Gavin pulled out my chair for me as we were seated, a simple gesture of courtesy that Brandon had stopped doing after our first anniversary. I felt strange sitting there, almost like an imposter pretending to be someone who went on romantic dinners with handsome architects. But as I settled into my seat and looked across the candlelit table at Gavin's warm smile, some of that strangeness began to fade away. "I have to be honest with you," I said, once the waiter had taken our drink orders and glided away silently. "I'm not entirely sure why I'm here tonight." Gavin nodded, his expression thoughtful and patient. "That's completely fair. I imagine yesterday was pretty overwhelming for you. That's one word for it." I smoothed the linen napkin in my lap, trying to organize the chaos of my thoughts into something coherent. I've never done anything like this before in my life. I've been married for 7 years. I've never even thought about another man in that way. And now I'm sitting in a restaurant with our neighbor, while my husband is probably pacing holes in the living room carpet. "Do you want to go back home?" Gavin asked. There was no judgment in his voice, no disappointment, just genuine curiosity and concern for my well-being. I thought about it carefully, turning the question over in my mind. I thought about walking back into that house on Maple Avenue, apologizing to Brandon the way I always did, resuming the familiar pattern of diminishment and resentment that had become our marriage over the years. The thought made my stomach turn with a dread so profound it surprised me. "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to go back." Our drinks arrived in crystal glasses, and Gavin leaned back in his chair, studying me with those steady gray eyes of his that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. "Can I tell you something, Jocelyn?" "Of course you can. I've watched you for 2 years now, not in a creepy way," he added quickly, and I couldn't help but smile at his earnestness. "But I notice things about the world around me. I'm an architect by profession. It's what I do for a living. I observe structures, identify weaknesses, imagine how things could be rebuilt differently and better. I look at buildings, but I also look at people. And what have you observed about me?" He took a sip of his wine before answering, choosing his words with care. "I've observed a woman who carries herself like she's constantly apologizing for taking up space in the world. I've seen you walk out to get the mail in the morning, and even something that simple seems weighted down by invisible burdens. I've watched you smile at neighbors while your husband talks over you, interrupt yourself mid-sentence when he gives you a certain look, shrink yourself to fit into whatever shape he seems to need that particular day." I felt tears prick unexpectedly at my eyes. No one had ever seen me so clearly before. No one had ever bothered to look that closely at who I really was. "I've also seen you when you think no one's watching," he continued gently. "When you're watering your plants on the front porch, or laughing at something on your phone, or walking back from work when you don't know anyone's looking at you. That woman is different. She's confident. She's vibrant. She's the woman your husband seems absolutely determined to bury under criticism and ridicule. Why didn't you ever say anything before now?" Gavin set down his glass carefully on the white tablecloth. "Because it wasn't my place to interfere in someone else's marriage. You were married. You seemed committed to making it work despite everything I saw. Who was I to say anything? But yesterday, when he made that joke, when he stood there and offered you up like you were nothing more than an inconvenience he wanted to be rid of, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I know what it feels like to be undervalued and dismissed by someone who's supposed to love you unconditionally, and I couldn't watch it happen to you anymore without at least offering you an alternative. The waiter appeared silently to take our dinner orders, and I was grateful for the interruption. It gave me a moment to compose myself, to process everything Gavin was saying and what it meant for me. When the waiter left, I found my voice again. I don't know what happens after tonight, I admitted honestly. I don't know if I'm ready to leave my marriage. I don't know if I'm ready for anything at all, honestly. Everything feels like it's shifting beneath my feet, and I'm just trying not to fall. Gavin reached across the table and gently touched my hand where it rested beside my bread plate. You don't have to know anything right now. Tonight doesn't have to be about decisions or plans or figuring out the entire future. It can just be about two people sharing a meal and having a real conversation. Whatever you need it to be, that's exactly what it is. For the first time in hours, I felt my shoulders relax completely. The tension I had been carrying since the barbecue began to release its grip on my muscles. Thank you, I said quietly. For seeing me, for saying something when you didn't have to, for giving me the chance to remember what it feels like to be treated with basic human respect. Everyone deserves that, he said simply. Especially you, Jocelyn. Over dinner, I learned about Gavin's life in ways I had never known before, despite living 3 houses apart for 2 years. He had grown up in Knoxville, the son of a high school English teacher and a registered nurse who worked nights at the local hospital. He had always loved building things, even as a small child, constructing elaborate forts in his backyard with scrap wood, and dreaming of designing skyscrapers that would touch the clouds someday. He had married young, to his college sweetheart, but the relationship had ended 5 years ago when she left him for a colleague at her law firm. That's when I moved to Nashville, he explained, twirling his fork in his pasta. I needed a fresh start in a completely new place, a new city, new projects at work, new life entirely. It took me a long time to stop feeling like a failure for not being able to make my marriage work, but eventually I realized that sometimes people just grow in different directions. It doesn't mean anyone is broken or worthless. It just means the fit is wrong. I thought about his words as I twirled my own pasta on my fork. I don't think Brandon and I grew in different directions, I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. I think we were always different people underneath the surface. I just convinced myself that love would be enough to bridge the gap between us. And now, what do you think? Now I'm realizing that love isn't supposed to feel like a constant negotiation where I always lose. It's not supposed to require me to be less than I am, just so someone else can feel more comfortable. I've been so afraid of being alone that I've been willing to be lonely inside my own marriage for years. Does that make any sense? Gavin nodded with deep understanding. It makes perfect sense to me. And for what it's worth, being alone is not the worst thing in the world. Sometimes it's the first step toward finding yourself again after you've been lost for so long. Our main courses arrived beautifully plated, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics as we ate. He told me about the project he was currently working on, a community center in East Nashville that would include a public library, a youth sports facility, and a small theater for local performances. His eyes lit up when he talked about architecture, about creating spaces where people could gather and grow and connect with each other. I found myself genuinely interested in what he had to say, asking questions, sharing my own thoughts about design and community, and what makes spaces feel welcoming rather than sterile. You're easy to talk to, he said at one point, looking almost surprised by his own observation. So are you, I replied honestly, and I meant it completely. For years, conversation with Brandon had felt like navigating a minefield blindfolded. I never knew which topic would trigger his insecurity, which comment would be twisted into an argument later, which observation would be used against me when he needed ammunition. But with Gavin, the words flowed naturally like water over smooth stones. He listened when I spoke, asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually paying attention, seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on things rather than waiting for his turn to talk. It was such a stark contrast to what I had grown accustomed to that I almost couldn't believe it was real. Around 9 o'clock, as we were sharing a tiramisu and debating the merits of different coffee roasts with surprising passion, I looked up to see a familiar figure storming through the restaurant entrance like a thundercloud. My stomach dropped like a stone into deep water. Brandon's face was flushed and angry red, his eyes wild with a combination of alcohol and rage. He had clearly been drinking heavily since I left. He scanned the dining room until he spotted us in the corner, and then he strode toward our table with a fury that made other diners turn and stare in alarm. "Are you kidding me right now?" he shouted as he approached, his voice far too loud for the refined atmosphere. "You're actually here? With him?" Gavin stood up calmly, positioning himself between Brandon and me with a deliberate movement. "Brandon, you're making a scene. Let's take this outside where we can talk privately." "Don't tell me what to do in my own city," Brandon snarled, his words slightly slurred. "That's my wife you're sitting with. My wife. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand that you publicly offered to trade her away less than 24 hours ago," Gavin replied, his voice steady and controlled in a way that seemed to infuriate Brandon further. "If you valued your wife so much, maybe you should have shown it before now." Brandon's face twisted with rage so intense it distorted his features. He looked past Gavin to where I sat frozen in my chair. "Get up, Jocelyn. We're going home right now." I felt every eye in the restaurant fixed on our table. The hostess was already reaching for the phone at her station, probably to call security or the police. I could feel the familiar pull of compliance tugging at me, the deeply ingrained urge to defuse the situation, to minimize the damage, to apologize my way back to some semblance of peace. But then I looked at Gavin, standing there calmly between us, protecting me from a man who had never protected me from anything in our entire marriage. And I looked at Brandon, red-faced and demanding, treating me like a possession to be reclaimed rather than a person to be respected. And I made my choice with clarity I had never felt before. No. The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, waiting to explode. Brandon stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't process what I had just said to him. "What did you just say to me?" I said no. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling but my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going home with you, Brandon. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again." His face contorted with fury so intense it frightened me even across the distance Gavin maintained between us. "You can't do this to me. You can't just walk out on 7 years of marriage because of some stupid joke I made." "It wasn't just a joke," I said, the words flowing freely now that the dam had finally broken. "It was the last in a very long line of jokes, of comments, of put-downs and dismissals that have slowly convinced me that I'm not worth anything outside of what I provide for you. You've spent years making me feel small and inadequate, and I've spent years letting you do it because I was afraid of exactly this moment. But I'm done now. I'm done shrinking myself to fit into your idea of what a wife should be." "You're being dramatic and ridiculous," he scoffed loudly, playing to the audience of horrified diners around us. "Everyone has problems in their marriage. Every marriage has issues that need work. You don't just throw away everything we built because you had a bad day." "This isn't about one bad day," I replied firmly. "This is about 7 years of bad days strung together. 7 years of feeling like a burden to my own husband. 7 years of watching you take everything I am and reduce it to a punchline for your entertainment. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who celebrates my independence instead of resenting it. Someone who encourages my ambitions instead of undermining them at every opportunity. Someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession." By now, a manager in a dark suit had approached our table, flanked by a security guard who looked like he could handle much worse than a drunken husband. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately," the manager said firmly to Brandon. "You're disturbing our guests." Brandon looked around wildly, seeming to finally notice the audience he had attracted with his outburst. Couples were whispering behind their menus. A family with young children was hurrying toward the exit. The entire restaurant had stopped their meals to watch our drama unfold before them. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "You're all insane." But his bravado was fading rapidly. The public humiliation he had tried to inflict on me was rebounding onto him instead. Gavin stepped forward, still calm, but with an edge of steel in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I think you should go now, Brandon. Go home, sleep it off. And when you wake up tomorrow, I hope you spend some time thinking about how you ended up here tonight. Because from where I'm standing, you're the one who destroyed your marriage, not Jocelyn." For a moment, I thought Brandon might swing at him. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white, his jaw set hard. But the security guard had positioned himself strategically nearby, and Brandon was just sober enough to recognize a losing battle when he saw one clearly. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You're going to regret this decision for the rest of your life." Then he turned and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. The front door slammed behind him with a finality that echoed through the silent room. I sank back into my chair, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and emotion. Gavin sat down across from me, his hand covering mine on the tablecloth reassuringly. "Are you okay?" I looked at him. This man I barely knew who had just stood up for me in a way no one ever had before in my entire life. "I think I will be," I said slowly. "I think for the first time in a very long time, I'm actually going to be okay." The manager approached apologetically, offering to comp our entire meal and call us a car service. Gavin handled everything efficiently, shielding me from having to make any more decisions. I sat there in a daze, processing what had just happened. I had said no. I had refused to comply. I had stood up for myself in front of a room full of strangers, and the world hadn't ended. Brandon had shown everyone exactly who he was underneath his charming facade, and instead of being embarrassed for me, people were looking at him with disgust and pity. This was the clarity I had been waiting for without even knowing it. All the doubt, all the guilt, all the second-guessing that had kept me trapped for so long, it all evaporated in the face of Brandon's public meltdown. He had made our private dysfunction visible for everyone to see, and in doing so, he had freed me from the prison of pretending everything was fine. Gavin drove me home through the quiet Nashville streets, the city lights blurring past my window. We didn't talk much during the ride. He seemed to understand that I needed space to process, and I was grateful for his silence and patience. When we pulled up in front of my house on Maple Avenue, I noticed that all the lights were on inside. Brandon was home, probably waiting to continue our fight. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during the restaurant confrontation. I wasn't afraid anymore. "Thank you," I said to Gavin sincerely, "for dinner tonight, for standing up for me, for everything." He smiled softly at me. "You don't have to thank me for treating you with basic respect, but you're welcome." "What happens now?" I asked, the question directed at myself as much as at him. "Now you go inside and take care of yourself tonight. And tomorrow, if you want to talk, I'm just 3 houses down the street." He paused, then added, "Whatever you decide about your marriage, about your life, just know that you deserve to be happy. You deserve to be with someone who lifts you up instead of tearing you down constantly. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Then I opened the car door and walked up the stone path to my front door, ready to face whatever came next. As I put my key in the lock, I heard Gavin's car pull away behind me. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped inside to face the rest of my life. The confrontation that night was brutal, but surprisingly short. Brandon was waiting in the living room, the remains of a 6-pack scattered across the coffee table like evidence of his evening. He launched into a tirade the moment I walked through the door, accusations and insults flying like shrapnel in every direction. I let him rant without interruption. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't explain. I simply listened, watching him exhaust himself against the wall of my silence. When he finally ran out of steam, slumped on the couch with his head in his hands, I spoke the words I should have spoken years ago. I want a divorce. The silence that followed felt like oxygen filling a room that had been locked shut for 7 long years. Brandon lifted his head slowly, his expression moving through disbelief, confusion, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like fear. You don't mean that. I do mean it. I sat down in the chair across from him, folding my hands in my lap calmly. This marriage has been dying for years, Brandon. We've been going through the motions, pretending everything is fine while we slowly destroy each other. I can't do it anymore. I won't do it anymore. Because of him? Because of one date with our neighbor? No, because of me. Because I finally remembered who I was before I started disappearing into this marriage. Because I spent 7 years believing that your love was conditional on me being smaller, quieter, less ambitious than I really am. And because yesterday, when you stood in front of everyone and offered to trade me away, you showed me exactly how little you value what we have. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost pleading. We can work on this together. We can go to counseling. I can change. You've said that before, I reminded him gently. After the time you mocked my promotion at your office party, after you convinced me to turn down that job opportunity, after every fight where I begged you to see things from my perspective, every time you promised to change, and every time, things went right back to the way they were. It'll be different this time around. Maybe it would be, but I don't have it in me to find out. I stood up slowly, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, I'll start looking for an apartment. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the details. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You've already thought this through. I've been thinking about it for years, I admitted honestly. I just needed something to finally push me over the edge. You gave me that yesterday. In a twisted way, I should probably thank you. I left him sitting there in the wreckage of our marriage and climbed the stairs to the guest room. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke the next morning, I felt lighter than I had in years. The following weeks were a blur of logistics and emotions. I found an apartment in Germantown, a cozy 1-bedroom with big windows and a small balcony where I could grow herbs in the sunshine. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who specialized in divorce proceedings and took no nonsense from anyone. I began the slow process of untangling my life from Brandon's, dividing assets and memories with clinical precision. Brandon fought the divorce at first, refusing to believe it was really happening. But as the weeks turned into months, even he had to accept reality. Our marriage was over. My sister Chloe was my rock through it all. She helped me move into my new apartment, bringing boxes and wine and a willingness to listen whenever I needed to process. She never said I told you so, though she had every right to after all those years of biting her tongue. I'm proud of you, she told me one night as we sat on my new balcony, watching the sunset paint the Nashville skyline gold and orange. I know this hasn't been easy, but you're handling it with so much grace. I don't always feel graceful, I admitted. Some days I feel like I'm falling apart completely. That's okay too, she said warmly. Falling apart is sometimes the first step toward putting yourself back together in a better way. As I settled into my new life, I began to rediscover parts of myself I had buried during my marriage. I started waking up early to run along the river, something I had loved in college but had stopped doing after Brandon complained about the early morning noise. I signed up for a pottery class on weekends, getting my hands dirty with clay and creating imperfect, beautiful things. I accepted that promotion at work I had been hesitating about, no longer worried about outshining anyone. The Jocelyn who emerged from the divorce was stronger, more confident, and more herself than she had been in years. I didn't recognize her at first. She was a stranger who looked back at me from the mirror with clear eyes and a steady gaze. But over time, I began to remember her. This was who I had been before Brandon. This was who I could be again. Gavin and I kept in touch throughout those months. He would text occasionally, checking in, asking how I was doing. We went for coffee a few times, walks in the park, low-key meetings that felt like friendship slowly evolving into something more. I wasn't ready for a relationship, and he understood that completely. He never pushed, never pressured. He simply showed up, consistently and kindly, proving through his actions that not all men saw my independence as a threat. About 3 months after my divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my apartment on a Friday evening, eating dinner alone, and feeling perfectly content about it, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Gavin standing there, holding a paper bag from my favorite Thai restaurant down the street. "I thought you might want some company tonight," he said, a little sheepish, "and some pad Thai." I laughed and stepped aside to let him in. We ate on my couch, watching a documentary about architecture that he had been wanting to show me, and talked about everything and nothing. It was easy, comfortable, without any of the landmines I had grown accustomed to navigating. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as the documentary credits rolled. "Of course you can." "That night at the barbecue, when I asked what time I could pick you up, I fully expected you to say no, or to laugh it off, or to come up with some excuse. When you said 7 o'clock and just walked away, I think I stopped breathing for about a minute." I smiled, remembering that moment clearly. I surprised myself too. I think something just snapped inside me. Years of swallowing my feelings, of accepting treatment I never should have accepted. It all came to a head in that moment. Your offer gave me an out I didn't know I was looking for. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Not that your marriage was bad. That makes me sad, honestly. But I'm glad you found your way out of it, and I'm glad I got to be a small part of that." I reached over and took his hand gently. "You were more than a small part. You showed me what respect looks like in action. You reminded me that I deserve to be valued. That matters more than you know." He squeezed my hand softly. "For what it's worth, I've never seen you as the woman your husband described. I've only ever seen a woman who was too vibrant to be contained by someone else's limitations. Someone who deserved to be celebrated, not diminished." We sat there in comfortable silence, the Nashville night glowing through my windows. I didn't know what the future held for us, whether this friendship would grow into something more or remain exactly what it was. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had chosen myself, and that choice had led me here, to this moment of peace and possibility. 6 months after the divorce, I received news about Brandon through the neighborhood grapevine. Chloe's husband had heard it from someone who worked with him at the company. After our split became public knowledge, Brandon's reputation had taken a significant hit. The story of the barbecue had spread, as stories do in tight-knit communities, and people began looking at him differently. The charming salesman persona he had cultivated for years started to crumble as more and more people realized there was something ugly beneath the surface. He had been passed over for a promotion at work, losing out to a younger colleague he had always dismissed as inferior. His sales numbers dropped dramatically as clients picked up on his increasingly bitter and hostile attitude. Finally, about 5 months after our divorce, he was asked to leave Travala Group entirely. The company cited performance issues, but everyone knew the real reason. He had become toxic to work with, and no one wanted to be around him anymore. I also learned that he had tried to start dating again, with predictably disastrous results. Word had gotten around about how he treated his wife, and the eligible women in his social circle wanted nothing to do with him. He was apparently spending most of his evenings alone in the house we used to share, which he could barely afford to maintain on a single income now. The irony of him ending up isolated and lonely after years of making me feel that way inside our marriage was not lost on me. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing this news. I didn't feel vindicated or triumphant. Mostly, I just felt sad. Sad that it had taken public humiliation and professional consequences for Brandon to face the truth about himself. Sad that he might never actually learn the lessons life was trying to teach him. Sad that I had wasted 7 years on a man who was never capable of seeing me clearly. But I also felt free. Whatever happened to Brandon now was his journey, not mine. I had done my part by finally walking away. As for Gavin, things between us continued to develop slowly and naturally. By the 1-year anniversary of that fateful barbecue, we were officially together. He never rushed me, never tried to define what we were before I was ready. He simply remained present, patient, and kind, proving every day that partnership could be a source of strength rather than diminishment. One summer evening, we found ourselves at my sister's house again. Another barbecue, another gathering of family and friends. As I stood by the picnic table, watching Gavin joke with Chloe's husband and help flip burgers on the grill, I felt someone come up beside me. "You look happy," Chloe said, handing me a glass of lemonade. "I am happy," I said, and meant it completely. "That guy over there," she said, nodding toward Gavin. "He looks at you like you hung the moon." "He makes me feel like I did." Chloe smiled warmly. "That's how it's supposed to be." I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the years of shrinking myself, the joke that had finally broken something loose inside me, the terror and exhilaration of accepting that date, the confrontation at the restaurant, the divorce, the rebuilding. All of it had led to this moment, standing in my sister's backyard with the summer sun warm on my face and a future full of possibility stretching out before me. Gavin caught my eye across the yard and smiled. That warm, genuine smile that still made my heart skip. I smiled back at him. I had learned something important over the past year. Accepting that date had never really been about Gavin at all. It had been about me. About finally choosing myself, after years of choosing someone else's comfort over my own well-being. About remembering that I was worthy of respect, of kindness, of love, that didn't come with conditions and fine print attached. Brandon's downfall had been entirely of his own making. His cruelty, his need to diminish others to feel big himself, his inability to value what he had until it was gone forever. He was still struggling to rebuild his life, still alone in that empty house, still facing the consequences of treating people like possessions rather than partners. Meanwhile, I had built something new and beautiful from the ashes of what he destroyed. The revenge, if you could call it that, was simply living well. Brandon had tried to diminish me, to trade me away like I was nothing, and instead, I had used that moment to reclaim everything he had taken from me. My confidence, my ambition, my sense of self-worth, my belief that I deserved happiness and love. Looking back on everything now, I realized that accepting that date at 7 p.m. had been the first step toward the life I was always meant to live. It wasn't about revenge or proving him wrong. It was about finally stepping toward the person I was always supposed to become, and I had never once looked back since.